Hey guys, Coach Pop here. Thanks for joining me for today's video cast. Today we're continuing our examination of urban civilization and its consequences. However, whereas last time we sort of looked at how civilization begins and what exactly constitutes a civilization, today we're going to focus on particular civilizations that started in what is called the first wave of civilizations among some historians, but the College Board uses the term core civilizations, and these are the 6 core civilizations that the College Board said that you needed to know in the key concept outlined in the previous course design. But there's a couple of things to note. First of all, these two in the Americas, we're going to come back to those in a couple of weeks. So from here on out of the course, what we're focusing on instead is Afro-Eurasia, the old world, so to speak. And in particular, if you notice that the 4 core civilizations, really it's like Afro-Asia. It's Africa and Asia, not so much in Europe, at least initially. So we're going to focus on those in particular today and for the next several days, several weeks in fact. But the thing I want to point out is what you need to know about them is the chronological order and the geographical proximity, how they're related to each other in space, but also the time order, which one comes first, second, and third. You don't need to know the specific dates, but you do need to know what the order is. And so the focus question that we're gonna examine, it's only one, unlike the previous presentations I've given, but it's a biggie, and it's one you're not going to be able to fully answer until after the activity we do in class. But that is to what extent the core civilizations of Afro-Eurasia meet the 5 criteria. If you recall, we sort of established defining what a civilization is with its many different problems associated with an us versus them attitude. Instead, we're going to focus on what do you have to have in order to be a civilization. Those are the 5 criteria, the features of civilization from yesterday's presentation. But there's a new verb involved in that. And this is a verb that's frequently used on the longer writing portions of the AP World Test, and that is evaluate. And if you look at that word, value is at the core of that. Assigning value. To what extent? Some do more than others. That's what we're going to focus on today and again in tomorrow's activity. How much do the core civilizations meet those criteria? To begin with, then, let's start with the first civilization anywhere in the world that appears in Mesopotamia. And you'll remember from middle school history and geography, Mesopotamia means land between the rivers. Meso means between. The 2 rivers are the Tigris and the Euphrates. But the key idea here, and this is different from other civilizations, is that Mesopotamia refers to a place, not a particular people. Mesopotamian civilization occurs in this particular place. It was started by a people called the Sumerians, and we don't know exactly what their story is, where they came from, but it will be extended by waves of migrations of other people, including Semites and Indo-Europeans that we'll talk about in the immediate future, who basically just copied the way of civilization of these particular people. So that's sort of a big context, but let's look specifically now at the features of civilization. First of all, they had many very large cities, at the time among the largest cities that the world had ever seen before, and many of them. But what's kind of unusual, they did have a state government, but it was organized as a city-state. And this is a really important concept to keep in mind. In a city-state organization, every city is like a totally independent country. You have your own king, you have your own bureaucracy, you have your own military. And even though, like in the case of the Sumerians, they all spoke the same language, they all had the same gods, they essentially had the same culture, but they thought of themselves as being citizens of a particular state, and that state was defined by a city and the immediate region around it. That's a kind of organization that's going to come up repeatedly throughout world history, but that appears to have been the first form of sort of state organization. In terms of their social stratification, the hierarchy was exceedingly strict. Priests and scribes tended to be at the top, scribes being those who have the ability to read and write. We'll talk about them in a moment. Farmers and laborers, they had slaves in their social hierarchy, as we'll see tomorrow. A very sort of typical social system that included patriarchy. One of the things that's kind of novel for them, though, is that these social levels, the social stratification, becomes encoded in the first law, the Code of Hammurabi. That's something we'll examine in the next couple of days. That's a novel idea. Like, that had never happened before in world history. In terms of the public works, extensive irrigation problems. They've got two rivers that are close to each other that form a valley, great for growing crops, but you need irrigation in order to do that. The monumental architecture included palaces and tombs. There were also, I would point out, this is something you might want to put it out in the margin, city walls. Because they had city-states, every state had its own, or every city was a state and had its own military. Every city had a huge defensive wall to protect it. But the really important monumental architecture to know here are what's known as ziggurats. And ziggurats are these kind of like step pyramids. But here's the thing about them. They were built by the state. In other words, the king of the city-state would actually fund and organize the labor to do that. But it was for the purpose of public ritual. And it was a way of sort of solidifying the power of the king, who claimed part of his authority from the gods to claim that he was the rightful owner of the monopoly on power to enforce the rules of the civilization. So it's not exactly a pyramid, but it's unlike the pyramids that we're accustomed to, which I'll talk about in just a moment, insofar it was for a public display of ritual that made everybody who was a part of the city-state feel like they were invested in it. They also had the world's first writing system, which is known as cuneiform. Literally, in Latin, cuneiform means wedge-shaped. That's the name the Romans gave it because of the way that it was particularly written. It was later on used to describe stories of the origins of the world and hymns and poems, but initially it was used to record transactions, particularly taxes and trade. It's called wedge-shaped, though, because of how it was written. And it's just kind of an interesting thing, because this happens as well in Egypt. Because they live in a river valley, there's a whole bunch of clay, which is essentially really dense mud on a shore of a river. But they also use this plant called a reed, which grows in shallow river beds, that when you cut it and then dried it, it left a kind of wedge shape when you pressed it in the clay. And that's how their writing system began. And again, it was initially to record transactions. Later on, people realized you could use this for all sorts of other things. In terms of their general culture, though, there's something kind of unusual about Mesopotamia, which is frequently related to what happens in Egypt. That has to do with their geography and how that affects their culture. First of all, the Tigris and the Euphrates have very unpredictable flooding. They're violent storms that appear out of nowhere that cause massive flooding. Moreover, if you look at a topographic map of Mesopotamia, there's no like real geographical boundaries, and so it's easy for somebody to invade them. The bottom line is this leads to a kind of culture of fear. Like a flood could come out of nowhere and wipe you out, or an invader could come out of nowhere. And consequently, culturally, they have a very kind of pessimistic view. Their art is very understated. Their belief in the afterlife. Everybody, regardless of your social status or your religious beliefs, everybody goes to this same place, a house of clay and dust, where your body is transformed into clay and you eat dust as a meal and for all of eternity in shadows. It's a very kind of dark and pessimistic view that many scholars have related to the fact that the geography is just wholly unpredictable. You could do everything right and a storm shows up and your city is completely demolished because of the floods have wiped out all of your fields. Now, Mesopotamia then is the site of the first of these civilizations. The second one appears in the Nile Valley. We call this generally Egypt. So the Nile Valley, another river valley, but there's a couple of things to note before we get into many detail about that. First of all, geographically, we need to understand the distinction between Lower and Upper Egypt. And this is, again, this gets back to our notion that the north always has to be in top. Lower Egypt is actually the northern part of Egypt. Upper Egypt is the southern part, and the reason for that has to do with, if you think about it, where does water flow in a river? It always flows from higher elevation to lower elevation. Upper Egypt is the part of the Nile that is higher elevation. Lower Egypt, even though it's north, and this is kind of unusual for most of the big rivers in the world, is the area where it starts to go towards the Mediterranean. It's closer to sea level. That's going to turn out to be an important factor later on. Similarly, there's this weird convention about Egyptian history where the periods of time in Egyptian history are referred to as kingdoms, although really what they are dynasties, that is, different lines of kings. So traditionally, we talk about an old kingdom, a middle kingdom, and a new kingdom. They're, in terms of the area, their kingdoms are not that different. What's different is they change the family lines for those three. In terms of their government and urbanization, first of all, they do have cities, but their cities are not nearly so numerous or as big as those in Mesopotamia. But unlike Mesopotamia, they don't have a system of city-states. Instead, they have one big region ruled by a king. Now, the first pharaoh, Menes I, which you'll see in tomorrow's activity, he gets the title pharaoh because he's the king of Lower Egypt, and then he conquers Upper Egypt, and pharaoh is technically the title for the king of the two lands. And so that area that he controls is way bigger than it is in Mesopotamia. And yet, it's not like it's a more centralized government, because a city-state system implies that you have many more different independent governments, each of which has its own bureaucracy and centralized power. So many fewer big cities. So urbanization is less, but one big kingdom. In terms of their social hierarchy, it's really, really similar to the social hierarchy, the social stratification that appears in Mesopotamia. The priests and scribes are at the top, farmers and laborers at the bottom. They too have slaves, although, for example, the pyramids were not built by slaves. Like, it wasn't such a big deal as many people think. One of the things that's unique, though, is the degree of patriarchy was a little less. Women actually had legal rights in Egypt that they did not have in Mesopotamia. In terms of public works, again, extensive irrigation was crucial. The Nile Valley has to have channels dug in order to supply water to the fields in order to grow enough grain. Palaces and tombs, similar to Mesopotamia. One big difference, though, is the pyramids. And the pyramids, obviously, everybody has some image in their mind about the pyramids. But the thing to remember about the pyramids, unlike ziggurats, which were designed for public rituals, pyramids were actually giant funeral monuments. And part of what we understand of what was going on is this served the belief that the pharaoh, when he died, became a god. And so the pyramids were kind of like giant machine that would propel the soul of the pharaoh up towards the heavens. So it's a funeral monument, still monumental architecture, still projecting the power and the grandeur of the ruler, but in a different way than the ziggurats were. In terms of writing, as most of you will remember from middle school, they had hieroglyphs. The word hieroglyph is actually a Greek word that means literally sacred writing. And the reason the Greeks called this hieroglyphs is because the only place they saw them were carved on the tombs of their great leaders. It turns out, though, there was another form of writing called Demotic script, which was like a kind of cursive. And what we do know about hieroglyphs, though, is it started off as a kind of accounting system. So similar to cuneiform, it was initially used to record transactions, and then people could figure it out. But I guess a kind of difference is hieroglyphs being carved into stone in monuments towards to celebrate the lives of pharaohs and important people. It had a kind of lasting impression. If you look at this particular image, one of the things that's interesting to me about hieroglyphs is that it can be written in any direction. You can go left to right, top to bottom. You can go in a circle. It doesn't matter. But there's a clue, which I think is really revealing about Egyptian view of the world. If you look at this particular image, you can tell that this is supposed to be read top to bottom, right? And you can tell that because it's designed into columns. But here's the thing. Do you read the columns right to left, or do you read them left to right? Well, that's a trick question, because the answer is it could be either way, except the way it's written gives you a clue. All of the characters, if you look at the animals that look like the hieroglyphs that look like animals, like this one, or this one, or this one, they're all facing to the right. But what is interesting about that is the hieroglyphs will face the direction from which they came. So this is supposed to be read from right to left. What's interesting to me about that is we have this tendency to think of like an image of the future as we are facing the future. The past is behind us and we face the future. For the Egyptians, though, it was the opposite. And frankly, it kind of makes more sense to me. We know the past. We can see the past, but we can't see the future. I find that a very interesting cultural effect of the culture of ancient Egypt. That is closely related to their geography as well, but in a very different way from Mesopotamia. The Nile floods very predictably. It floods at about the same time every single year, and so it becomes associated with the power of Pharaoh, because the Pharaoh knows that it's going to happen at a certain time. His priests know it's going to happen. So he performs a public ritual, and lo and behold, there's the flood. And there's not so many catastrophic, unpredicted floods. And as a consequence, their outlook in terms of their culture is very optimistic. So their art, for example, very much showing all the blessings of life and the good things about life. Their belief in the afterworld, that if you pass a certain test after you die, you get to go to this eternal paradise forever. That test, by the way, is written in the Book of the Dead, which is something we'll talk about more later on. But what's interesting when you compare the Nile civilization to Mesopotamian civilization is the way in which geography has really shaped the very different cultural outlooks of the two civilizations. Okay, so Mesopotamia first, Nile Valley second, third, and really close to the Nile Valley civilization. In other words, it's just slightly older than Egyptian civilization. It occurs in the Indus Valley, a region we call South Asia in AP World History. First of all, in terms of urbanization, they had many big cities. Not quite so many as Mesopotamia, way more than Egypt. Not quite so big as Mesopotamia, way bigger than Egypt. But like Mesopotamia, they seem to have had a city-state system where every city was like its own independent state. But what is unique about that is all of the cities were laid out in a very similar plan. Now, that suggests that somebody who was like above the city-states was responsible for designing the urban planning because it's all uniform. It's the same. So Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro are laid out very similar, even though they were considered separate city-states. In terms of their social stratification, though, unlike the other core civilizations, they are much more egalitarian. Looking at the structures in which they lived, there appears to have been only two sort of discrepancies, and even those weren't very big. There were the priests who acted as the bureaucrats, so essentially they were the elites, and then there was everybody else. But again, the difference between the two is not that great. There's all sorts of sculpture that celebrates what most historians, they call this the priest kings of the Indus Valley. These figures of people who are clearly in power, but if you look closely at this image, he seems to be in a kind of meditative state. He has some sort of spiritual awareness that gives him that particular power. In terms of the public works, extensive irrigation. Again, they're on the valley of the Indus River, so irrigating the fields for the crops is a big deal. One of the things unique, though, is they actually have indoor plumbing. Unlike any of the other core civilizations, they figured out a way how to bring fresh water into the dwellings of people and remove wastewater out of it. That's a pretty high-tech deal when you consider the civilizations at the time basically dug holes to go to the bathroom. They also appear to have been focused around public baths, and it appears that like ritual bathing was a big part of their society because every city had a giant public bath right in its center. Uniquely, though, they had no monumental architecture. There was no giant labor project to celebrate the greatness of their leader. So again, that sort of gets back to this idea of, compared to the other core civilizations, much more egalitarian. They did have a writing system that we call the Indus Valley script. What's unusual about it from our perspective, but not from theirs, is we don't know how to read it. And it's kind of an interesting phenomenon. They had writing, they clearly recorded transactions, but we don't know how to uncode it. Now, somewhere in the margin, I need you to write this term, because most of their writing appears in something called a cylinder seal. Cylinder seal, S-E-A-L. And it's not the animal seal. What they did is they had these hammered copper pieces. And if you remember, copper is very pliable. And so they could hammer both in, which if you look at the script up here, that's hammered into the copper, and some pointing out, which is hammered from the other side. But then what they would do is they'd take this copper that is really pliable and they would bend it around a cylinder. So like if you imagine your grandmother's rolling pin and you put this copper around the rolling pin, what they would do is they would roll that out on clay and it would become a kind of receipt. So if you notice in this particular image, we don't know this writing. We don't know what this says, but I mean, look at it. It's a bull. It's a domesticated bovine, and then there's some writing above it. It's not unlikely, although we don't know, that this is some sort of, hey, dude paid his taxes, he paid 2 bulls, so here you go, here's your receipt. But again, one of the reasons why we don't know an awful lot about the Indus Valley civilization compared to Mesopotamian Egypt is because we don't know how to read their writing. Moreover, because of the cylinder steels that lasted, if they had writing on other materials, those have been lost to time. Another unusual thing about them is we're not really sure why their civilization collapsed. It does appear climate change was an issue. Something changed in the climate of the Indus Valley that made it really, really difficult for them to grow enough food via crops to feed their populations. But at the more or less same time, these migrants moved in called Aryans. These are Indo-European migrants, and we'll talk more about them in the immediate future. But for many years, it was assumed that these new people moving in were invaders who conquered the Indus Valley civilization. And in fact, as we'll see, much of what we think of as the culture of South Asia, what we call India, really comes from the Aryans and not the Indus Valley civilization. They kind of replaced them very quickly. But it appears now that it was some combination. It wasn't an invasion. It was a migration that happened at the same time that the city-states of the Indus Valley were collapsing. Okay, that leads us to the last of the big 4 civilizations, core civilizations of Afro-Eurasia in the Yellow Valley. This is in the region that is known as East Asia. Typically, we refer to this as China, although, as we'll see, there is no such thing as China yet. The Yellow Valley is called that because the river, the Wanghe, is yellow. And the reason it's yellow is because of this stuff called loess. And as we'll see in just a moment, there's something unusual about the geography of this region of East Asia. The wind pattern comes over India, hits the Himalayas, picks up these little particles of dust from the Himalayas and jettisons it up into the jet stream. It continues over a desert and then deposits that into this river valley. But that the nutrients within that dust are great for growing crops, but they also turn the water a slight yellow color. So this is important not just, because most people think the Yellow River is called that because it's so polluted, which, by the way, now it is. But it's always been the Yellow River because of that. But the second thing is those deposits that came from, hundreds, if not thousands of miles away actually make the soil very, very fertile. Something to understand about the way Chinese history, East Asian history is organized. At this time period, they are feudal dynastic kingdoms, okay? They're kingdoms, but they use feudalism. And feudalism is, relatively speaking, a rather unsophisticated social, political system. What that means is the king would grant lands to lords in order to ensure his loyalty, and then he's responsible for that land. But the lord would in turn give part of his land to other people in exchange for their loyalty, and then they're responsible for that land. So it doesn't take, there's no real centralized bureaucracy. Even though you have a king, it's sort of assumed that, well, if I give you land, you're just going to run the people and the system on that particular land. It doesn't actually take a highly centralized bureaucracy to do that. In terms of the dynasties, there's this dynasty called the Xia, which there's really sketchy archaeological evidence that exists. The Chinese, historically, like legends, they say there was this kingdom of the Xia kings, the dynasty of kings. We can't actually prove that convincingly based on archaeology yet. The first of these is the Shang, and so most of the time we'll talk about the Shang dynasty. That is this first wave of civilization in East Asia. They are later replaced by the Zhou dynasty. What's interesting, though, the Zhou dynasty were actually feudal lords of the Shang king. And eventually they just like got sick and tired of having that dude as king, and they overthrew him, but they kept that same feudal system in place. Compared to any of the other core civilizations, very few big cities, much fewer than the Indus Valley and Mesopotamia, but they did have a whole lot of agrarian villages, which again, that makes sense in the context of feudalism, because you don't need a strong central bureaucracy, because it's just everything is passed down to somebody at a lower level. The Yellow River, the Wanghe, is prone to flooding, and so irrigation, but especially flood control, was a very key part of the central government. They did have palaces for their kings. They had no monumental architecture to their kings or to their power other than palaces, though. In terms of their writing system, as some of you will know, the writing system in China we call characters. But the characters actually, and this is different from all of the other writing systems in the core civilization, didn't originate for recording transactions. Instead, they seem to have had a spiritual purpose. That purpose took place on something called an oracle bone. So here's how this works. The bone actually wasn't bone. It was typically the underbelly of a tortoise shell. And the priests would carve in these symbols. And these symbols had certain meaning, but a leader, for example, would go to the priests to get an oracle, a vision of the future. Like, should we go to war now? Is it time to plant? Should I try to have another son, or whatever it is? And the priest would carve in these symbols, throw the bone, which is not exactly bone, into a fire. And then it would heat up, and then cracks would develop as the bone heated up. And that's how they would determine the future. Wherever the cracks went, whichever characters they hit, that would be the answer. So if you think of it like an ancient 8-ball, if you've ever seen those 8-ball things, right? Like you ask a question and you shake it up, and then inside there's only a certain number of possible answers. It's just that one of them floats up so you can read it. It's a similar thing with the oracle bones. Like, it's going to crack somewhere. Which part is it going to hit? Well, they interpreted that as that's a sign from the gods. Over time, then, people realized those particular symbols could be used to express ideas. And one of the things that's unusual about Chinese characters is they're not related to sound. They apply to ideas only. And as we'll talk about later on, it's one of the reasons why Chinese culture is kind of unique, because it doesn't really matter what language you speak. You can still use the same writing system. Okay, so again, big idea here, the 4 core civilizations of Afro-Eurasia in order: Mesopotamia, Nile Valley, Indus Valley, Yellow Valley. So how did they all interact with each other? Well, this is where geography plays a crucial role. And besides the time order, The geography is a key thing to keep in mind for tomorrow's lesson. It turns out that 3 of these 4 core civilizations traded with each other, and as well as pastoralists. And if you remember, pastoralists have domesticated animals, but not plants. So they kind of move around all of the time. Nonetheless, they can produce things, particularly certain types of textiles that the civilized people, so-called, haven't figured out how to make yet. So all 4 of them trade with the pastoralists that are near them, but 3 of them traded with each other. The odd civilization out is China. And I want to look at this closely, and this is a key idea for tomorrow. Why did this happen? Well, here's a map of Afro-Asia, Africa on the left, East Asia on the right. Here is the location of the Yellow Valley civilization. That's the Huanghe River Valley right there. And look at it compared to the rest of Afro-Asia. If we go backwards, so the most recent is the Yellow Valley, the next most recent Indus Valley, closely before that was the Nile Valley, and then Mesopotamia being the first. But look at how they're distributed. That's interesting. So look where Mesopotamia is, for example. We know Mesopotamia and Egypt traded with each other. We also know that Mesopotamia and the Indus Valley traded with each other. That means that Mesopotamia is directly trading with 2 other civilizations. Egypt's trading with 1. Indus Valley's trading with 1. But indirectly, they have knowledge of what's going on in the other civilization. On the other hand, here's the Yellow Valley civilization. So during the Shang dynasty, for example, they are completely cut off because of geography, namely the Himalayas and this desert region up here. And it's not going to be for several, hundreds of years, if not thousands of years, that gap gets bridged. That's a pretty significant geographical obstacle. And so one of the things we're going to look at tomorrow is what are the consequences if these 3 civilizations know there's other civilizations out there, but these don't? How does that actually affect things? That's something we'll look at tomorrow. The last part of your outline involves extending the core civilizations. Fill in the blanks right now, but this is not something, this will be the point of tomorrow's homework and the activity that we do later in the week. Because what's going on here is, in addition to the 4 core civilizations, there were 2 big migrations that spread civilization. They didn't invent the first civilizations, but they helped to spread it. One of these groups are known as the Indo-European peoples. They are the ones that we think were the first to domesticate the horse, for example. And they will migrate throughout different parts of Afro-Eurasia and spread civilization with them where they go. And a second group that happens at about the same time are known as Semitic peoples. These were peoples that we think actually were related to the Natufians, the affluent foragers, if you remember from yesterday, who, again, migrated into certain regions, learned about civilization, and then spread it to other areas. So we'll come back to this in a couple of days. Just fill in the blanks for right now. So here's our focus question again. To what extent do the core civilizations of Afro-Eurasia meet the 5 criteria, the 5 parts of civilization? Well, I've given you some indication of that today. But in class tomorrow, we're going to focus on this much more closely, and you'll be able to answer that question more fully then. Here's the way I'm going to frame it tomorrow, though. How civilized were they? Now, we've seen the problems with this notion of using the term civilization and civilized versus barbarians. But if you accept the 5 criteria, the 5 features that, if you have these things, you're probably a civilization, Can we quantify that? Can we make value judgments like how much did they do these things? That's what we're going to focus on in class tomorrow. I want to thank you for your attention for now. I apologize. This is posted kind of late and it's a little bit longer than I'd like, but thank you for your attention. See you in class.